Alrighty, let's get going here. Let's see how we're doing. Still haven't looked up that answer. Okay. Okay, so we're obviously fast approaching the end. So I'm in a sort of race against time to finish up, but that's okay. I should be able to get through pretty much all I have if I move in an efficient way, which I never do. So I don't know what's going to happen. We'll figure it out. We'll end somewhere. I don't know. I'll tell you what the end of the course is when I get there. All right, so we were talking last time a little bit about some of the arguments in Haidt's book about the struggles that young men are having, right? Particularly how they're a little bit different than those that young women are having, right? Less around social media, more around things like video games, YouTube, and pornography, right? Okay, so when we look at the stats that Haidt quotes, right, he'll tell us that about 27% of young men live with their parents, right? So young in that kind of emerging adult range, 27% of them versus 17%. And as we move kind of up the age gradient, right, more towards like the end of emerging adulthood, as we enter our 30s, and into kind of even the 30s and 40s, we still see consistently many more men than women living with their parents. Now, at the very extreme end of this, we have, some boys, right? And this is, you kind of hear the cultural stereotypes about it. Basically, boys, men that have failed to launch and into their 20s and 30s are still, the stereotype is living in their parents' basements, playing video games all day long, right? And doing other things, of course, unmentionable things, which we will not mention. Now, what's really interesting is, like, some of these people become complete shut-ins, right? Their social kind of ties degrade to a tremendous extent. Now, the really interesting thing, and I always think of Japan as like slightly in the future for some reason, because a lot of the social trends that sort of start in Japan, maybe in the 1990s, start to show up in North America and other parts of the world just a little bit later, maybe about 15 to 20 years later. And so this thing of young men becoming total shut-ins started happening in Japan in the 1990s. Now, some of this might be related to Japan's like crazy work culture, right? Like work till you drop kind of work culture in Japan. And young men, especially young men who are working class and not seeing the advantage of this, just kind of checking out of the system. But it definitely starts in the 90s in the US. And there's some of these men that have now kind of stayed in this mode well into the beginning of their 40s, right? So, yeah, as economic opportunity declined with a stagnating Japanese economy, right? The Japanese economy went gangbusters through the 70s and 80s. And in the 90s, it sort of stalled, and the Japanese economy has never really recovered, right? The Japanese economy is basically a low-growth economy, and nothing the Japanese government has done has gotten it unstuck. More young men retreated into their childhood bedrooms. And again, like I said, some of these things sound familiar because if we're looking at a place like Canada, we may be seeing the, kind of beginnings of this same phenomenon, where our economic growth has gotten stuck and it's really, really hard to get it unstuck, right? Okay, so the Japanese term for these people, they actually come up with a word, it basically means shut-in, is hikokomori. Now, this problem has gotten so bad that there's like, how to put this? Some of the parents, right, have come to try and coax their adult sons out of their bedrooms and reintroduce them socially into the world. Because as they've spent more time kind of isolated, playing video games, watching television, and such. And again, none of this would have been possible before the internet and video games, because eventually you would have gotten so bored in your bedroom that you would have, wandered out and met a person. But as that, the internet has sort of come in and made that possible, more people actually, more through video chats and hopefully in person to kind of reintroduce them into the world. They call them almost like surrogate sisters, right? or we're trying to get these young men back into the social world. Okay, so we're starting to see this same phenomenon happening increasingly in the West, and even this lifestyle actually being promoted, right? Especially in places like Reddit, which, give me the crown, make me king for a day, and one of my official decrees would be to turn Reddit off just forever, burn the servers, destroy the infrastructure, salt the earth so nothing can ever grow there again. Reddit would be gone. 4chan and 8chan, as well. So you could go on Reddit. I haven't done it in a bit, but you could go to like r/hikokomori, and there's actually a forum where people like encourage each other in the hikokomori lifestyle, right? So maybe a bit of a social contagion there. I think the other one is neat, r/neat. I believe is still there. And again, a lot of the same kind of antisocial behaviors being promoted. Okay. So why is this appealing, right? Well, I mean, increasingly what Haidt argues is that increasingly what we've created for boys in particular is lives free of risk, right? Even the small ones. And we kind of see this, in these fun charts, right? Hospital admissions for unintended injuries, right? And what we see is if we go back to the year 2000, it was rate per 100,000. Boys were getting admitted at about 15,000 injuries per 100,000. All right, your 10 to 19-year-old boys, right? Your youngest part of the cohort was the most likely to be admitted to hospital for unintended injuries. There's a whole, maybe where subreddit or Reddit is kind of fun. There's a whole subreddit, which I always find super amusing, why women live longer. And it's literally just a bunch of videos of men and boys doing incredibly stupid things. It's fun. Go check it out if you have time. It's fun, right? Our most risk tolerant and likely to take risk boys, the ones who were honestly the ones getting injured doing stupid things, and then going for the hospital for it, was our 10 to 19-year-olds. By the time we hit 2019, they're the least likely. And their rates have roughly halved, right? Not quite halved, but roughly halved. Okay, so females were always way less likely, right? And the most, 10,000 hospital admissions per 100,000, but still it's gone down quite a bit. Again, not quite half, but heading in that direction. Why? Well, again, you can't get hurt, mostly, if you're sitting in your bedroom or playing video games, right? I don't know, maybe if the Xbox controller bounces off the wall and hits you in the head, maybe you can get injured and go to the hospital that way, right? But chances are, you're not going to get hospitalized for unintended injuries if you're sitting in a chair playing video games, right? Or on social media or whatever it happens to be, right? Now, some of this is good, obviously, right? We have fewer things like fewer injuries, fewer deaths, and fewer unplanned pregnancies in our young people. That is, generally a good thing. So I'll tell you a very quick, silly little anecdote. Teen pregnancies are at their all-time low, right? We've never had fewer teen pregnancies than we have today. So all of the, after-school or in-school sex ed and shows like 16 and Pregnant have done their job and convinced young people not to have sex and have babies, right? To at least use protection or whatever. Also, young people are having less sex, as we've already established. That is a good thing, right? However, we also, why it's funny is this, I used to use a textbook for this class, and the authors wanted to revise it, and for whatever reason, the publisher asked me to do the peer review on it, and I peer reviewed the shit out of that thing to the point where it did not get published because they still had a whole long section, I was really mean, a whole long section about teen pregnancies and how we needed to work to reduce teen pregnancies, and I'm like, I think there are more pressing issues for young people, given that the rate of teen pregnancies is at the lowest it's ever been. I mean, we also don't have 18 and 19-year-olds getting married anymore, so that also kind of helps. Okay, so we have fewer injuries, fewer deaths. So yeah, I said such mean things about the book. It wasn't just that. There were other problems with it. They basically hadn't updated anything. I think their tech chapter, they changed Snapchat to TikTok, like the word Snapchat to TikTok. And like, oh, the social problems of TikTok was changed from the social problems of Snapchat. And I was like, this chapter needs to be completely redone. And yeah, so the publisher was like, yeah, I don't think so. Okay, so we have fewer injuries, which is good in a way, fewer deaths, which is definitely good. But we've created a childhood kind of without risk, right? Or without about half as much risk in some cases, right? Along with this, what do we see? Well, male aggression has declined quite a bit, right? So if we talk externalizing disorders or externalizing symptoms, typically aggression is the big one, right? Boys were way up here, you know, standard factor of kind of externalizing disorders. They were much more aggressive, and they are quite a bit less aggressive today. No, but they have more internalizing disorders, right? Quite a few more internal, so more depression, more anxiety. So yeah, we've reduced aggression. There's just not as much aggression today, but with that aggression, lack of aggression, seems to come a lot of anxiety and depression. And for girls, right, oh boy, those internalizing disorders take a shoot up, right, in our great rewiring, and they are off to the races, right? We have a much higher factor of internalizing disorders. But again, externalizing has dropped a little bit for girls. And here, you know, enjoyment of taking risks, you know, boys aren't down a ton from where they started, right? But we definitely see a downward trend in risk-taking behavior and enjoyment, and girls are kind of roughly at the same place. They were never as likely to want to take risks. Now, what Haidt says is this also means there are fewer of those chances to get your little bumps and scrapes in life, right? Fall off the park, hit your head, get 15 stitches, whatever, and then move on and learn not to do that again, right? Or learn that you got to keep your hands up in a fight or you're going to get punched in the nose, right? All sorts of things like that. Okay. How do I feel about Haidt's calling Australia's under 16 social media ban the most important law ever? I don't know if it's the most important law ever, but I will tell you this, you know, just on a very personal level, that's my house, right? My kids don't get to use social media until they are at least 16. My daughter turns 16 on the 18th of January, and she's super excited. She's like, I'm getting Instagram. I'm like, wouldn't it be better to just hold off for another 10 years without it? I guess she kind of uses Pinterest in a very limited way, which is kind of social media. But, you know, my son is like, yeah, can I get Discord? And we're like, no. Are you 16? No, stop it. Shut up. And he asks like every week if we can have this discussion. I'm like, no. Which is really hard because some of his friends have been using social media since they were 8, which is really tough. I think it's correct, right? I think all of the research suggests that you would do every kid a favor by not having them on social media, you know, until they're well into their teens, like high school. I think that would actually be quite beneficial. And, you know, forcing tech companies to actually take more responsibility for their bullshit would also be really good. There's just a story out today that Facebook, or Meta, stupid name, has been well aware that Facebook is openly used for human trafficking, especially in Africa, in the Middle East. And they have done diddly squat to stop it, right? In the Middle East, it's like, what is it? Maid shopping? Basically, maids apparently in some Middle Eastern countries are also kind of like maid/prostitute. So there's a lot of, you know, trafficking of women through the Middle East in places like Qatar and the UAE. And it's all done through like Facebook, apparently. So these companies suck and we should not trust our children with them. So I totally agree. I love Australia's law. If we could have it here, I'd be happy. I feel like Danielle Smith has just enough crazy eyes to pull off a law like that. Okay, not a big fan of hers, but you know, if she could do that, maybe I'd change my mind. All right, the virtual world, right? So video games have always been more exciting for boys, you know, which is why if you look at like character design in video games, there's a lot of scantily clothed women, right? And that has long been the case, you know, going back to like Tomb Raider and such. Right? Video games are more exciting for boys. Boys have always been more into video games. going right back to the beginning of the format. But things got much more interesting in the early 2000s, right? Graphics got a lot better, right? We jumped from like the 16-bit era and the Super Nintendo to like the N64, the PlayStation, and computer games that were much better graphics. The internet got a lot faster as well. So, so Wi-Fi came in the 2000s. Laptops started to actually be feasible as devices that you could carry around. The early laptops, weighed as much as a table. They were super heavy and they lasted like an hour, but as batteries got better and power consumption got better, laptops got better as well. And then online porn really proliferates in the 2000s. We get the birth of the tube sites, right? Pornhub, or the hub sites, the Pornhub, and all of the kind of Pornhub offshoots. And then you got YouTube, which became a favorite. And then online gaming goes mainstream at the beginning with online gaming on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. But computer gaming had gotten really popular just a little bit before this, with titles like StarCraft being a really popular one. It's one of the early ones. You get WoW, or World of Warcraft, in the early 2000s, right? And like a whole bunch of other ones, bless you, that are really quite popular. And then once you get on the PS3 and Xbox 360, you get games like Call of Duty, and all of these things that are really, really popular. Okay, so smartphones also accelerate how much attention can be extracted from boys, right? Boys start to spend more time on smartphones as well, doing different things. Again, things like Reddit, YouTube, and pornography. And so you start getting that. And increasingly, boys' social status shifts online like girls, but in a different way, right? It gets to be how good you are at particular games, right? What's your rank in Fortnite or Rocket League or any of these kinds of games? How good are you at them? Like when you play with or against your friends, right? Who wins? Who has, who's the best? And so, there comes to be competitions and a huge impetus to spend a lot of time mastering these games and getting really, really good at them, right? And yeah, boys increasingly and often unsupervised wander through a bazaar of games, videos, online communities, and porn, right? And this constant online stimulation. Now, what gets added to this once they become adults increasingly is gambling and dating apps, right? So online gambling has definitely hit its sort of, apogee, at least so far. God, I hope it doesn't get any worse. Sports betting, online poker, and such have become very, very popular, and a lot of young men sink a lot of time and money into these things. And obviously, dating apps like Tinder promise a sort of easy reward of sex with a willing partner, even though that's increasingly more difficult as women have started to tune these apps out. But at least in the early days, a lot of men got on there hoping, right, to hook up with someone. But it's increasingly like a smaller and smaller selection of men who actually benefit from dating apps. Okay, porn. We already talked about porn, so let's just belabor its social effects and not what it is. What Haidt says is porn especially hijacks some deep evolutionary desires, right? So if you look at kind of, biology, evolution makes things alluring by giving you bursts of dopamine, right? So it's like, hey, that looks good, that feels good, do more of that. You get a dose of a hormone that makes you feel good, right? And one of those things for boys is looking at girls, right? Especially naked ones. Now, this used to be hard, right? Back in ye old times, in order to see a woman naked, you had to probably marry her, right? Or at least put in a lot of effort. It got a little bit easier starting in the 1960s with the advent of kind of mainstream published porn, things like Playboy and then Hustler and other magazine formats. but it was still relatively difficult, right? You had to go often to special stores or show ID to get these things. In the 2000s, things change a lot, right? Because online porn has no gatekeepers, right? Basically, anyone with internet access can get on a porn site and start looking at pornography. Now, I know that, some of them have like, just verify that you're 18, and you click a button saying you're 18, and then you're on the site, and wow, what a hard verification that was. But really, right, it's an open market to anyone with an internet-connected device, and increasingly we give our children unencumbered access to these things, from very, very young ages. Okay, so what Haidt says is wanting, again, I don't want to put it in crude terms, but wanting to be with girls, right? Because men are generally attracted to women, and generally one of the things they want to do is have sex at some point. It motivated boys to take risks like talking to girls or asking girls to a dance or something, right? Learning to date. And if you're wondering why, and I think this is a plausible, though not complete explanation, why a lot of boys seem much less socially competent today when it comes to things like dating, well, they don't get as much practice, right? Because from a very young age, they can get what they want through pornography, right? So once boys get laptops, high-speed internet, and then smartphones, porn takes over, right? And I showed you some of the statistics earlier in the course, but if we want to talk, hey, what's this? This is cheap sex, right? Porn is so easy that it can lead boys to choose the easy path rather than trying to engage in the risk of actually talking to girls. And bless you, they get worse and worse at it, right? The less practice you get, the less you have to sort of make yourself, a worthwhile person to talk to, learn how to talk to people, right? Build that cultural capital that it takes to get a girlfriend, right? The harder it becomes, right? So if you want to know where incel culture comes from, not entirely, but pornography plays a big role because it both conditions men to think that, sex with women should be easy because, in porn, I don't think it's usually like months of pursuit to get that girl to date you, right? It's usually pretty instantaneous. And it just conditions you to think that this is how women should be. And when they aren't, you get kind of upset potentially. Okay, so quote from Haidt here in page 202, porn separates the evolved lure, sexual pleasure, from its real-world reward, a sexual relationship, potentially making boys who are heavy users turn into men who are less able to find sex, love, intimacy, and marriage in the real world. And I think we saw that when we talked about our sex recession, right? And, just honestly, because the world only wants to confirm everything I have to say today, the cover of The Economist magazine this week is the cover story is about a relationship recession, right? So go pick up The Economist and all of that stuff. Oh my goodness gracious, this last point. So we've now entered the darkest of dark possible futures. One of the things that's proliferated really in the last 3 or 4 years since ChatGPT sort of burst onto the scene and everybody started talking about AI is AI relationships, but specifically AI girlfriends, right? And if you go honestly to the App Store or the Play Store, you can find literally hundreds of different apps that are basically like relationship simulators where you can, download the app, pay your monthly subscription fee, I presume, or some of them are tokenized, right? So you have to buy coins or some bullshit. And then you can interact with your AI partners, right? Some of them you can design them, design exactly the person that you would want to be in a relationship with. And there's early evidence that, again, this is leading to some of that retreat away from real human relationships. It's very preliminary, and I don't want to exaggerate it because there's like these, clickbaity headlines like, man wants to marry his AI girlfriend, right? Which I think are probably bullshit. But it's starting, and people are turning to these when they're really lonely as an alternative to real relationships. And I think if you just look at them, and go download it, I think you'll notice that all of the icons, they're all attractive looking women, right? It's not, these are mostly targeted at men, principally. Okay. Video games, the research on video games is a little bit less definitive. Some research has actually found benefits, particularly around agency, right? When boys get really good at a video game, they feel a boost in self-esteem. So what Haidt says is there's kind of two harms that we can talk about with video games. One of them is game addiction, and this is a subset of boys that are compulsive gamers, right? That, really cannot quit it, right? And when they don't have access to video games, things get very ugly. It's no longer a preference, it's really something that they're compelled to do. The second one I think is probably more important. And again, if you think of kind of the themes of the course, the opportunity cost, right? Every minute you spend playing a video game is a minute you're not doing something else, right? You're not taking a risk, you're not talking to a girl, you're not building a relationship with a trusted adult. You are, tapping buttons on a controller or a keyboard or whatever. You're not doing something else with your life. So those opportunity costs can mount, right? That lack of building social and cultural capital are the things that probably cost boys more at the end of the day than gaming addiction. Okay. I think this is my last slide. So, Gen Z boys and girls are both struggling, right, to put down roots in real world communities. And again, I just want to go back and highlight the thing we were talking about when I was talking about mental health. It was those young people that were the most rooted, right? The ones with the most trusted adults in their lives that were doing the best, right? That had less of those stress kind of markers to talk about, but they're having trouble because the world is sort of prioritizing against it, right? We've said the real world is dangerous. We should, you should stay home. Screens are safe, so spend more time on screens. Maybe not on purpose. We sort of built the world in that way without knowing it. So fewer and fewer young people are putting down roots in communities that are stable and long-term, right? Populated by known individuals, and I want to highlight known individuals, right? Because sometimes people are like, online communities are just as good. Okay, but people you've actually met, right? People that are pretty consistent, and people who will probably be there, 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, because they're part of your community league or your church or your synagogue or your mosque or, the political party that you're part of, right? The food bank, whatever, right? All these sorts of things matter, and the more stable it is, the more beneficial it is because you can build those connections with people. But increasingly, right, and I think Haidt says this, but I agree, increasingly their lives are made up of shifting groups of unknown people, right? Online communities, right? Fan communities, people they find in like-minded Facebook or Reddit communities or whatever it happens to be. But those groups are shifting, right? People disappear, change accounts, drop accounts, get banned, whatever. It's much less stable than communities that are, in real life. And so what it looks like is young people today are suffering from anomie, right? This idea that comes from Durkheim, this kind of lack of social direction and social norms. And what does it manifest as? Well, an increase in things like this. Young people saying that life feels meaningless, right? And we saw this, in my Twitter Monday kind of graphic, right? We see a big disconnect. And what's that disconnect? Maybe I should go back and look at it. If I can find my mouse. My mouse is being jerky. Where's my Twitter Monday slide? Did I get rid of it? Right? Our least likely to say life is meaningless is our most rooted young people, right? Conservative, I don't know why conservative matters here, but religion is important, right? So they're more likely to be rooted. And even those, liberal and religion is important, still doing better in terms of life is meaningless than our liberal, not religion, not important. And again, I don't think this is about religion necessarily. I don't think religion is like some magical formula to fix your life. I think it's all about community ties, right? How integrated you are into these long-term communities that are stable and where people show up. It just so happens that religion is one of the last places that this is true, right? Because of that common purpose that religion gives people, they show up. And a lot of times people don't show up to anything anymore. Trust me, people have tried to create atheist churches and it just goes nowhere. I don't know why. Okay. Cool. All right. How am I doing for time? I have some time. All right. Now I'm going to attempt to do the impossible, or the merely possible. I'm going to jump to a new and completely, or a different and completely new unit, which I just made a few days ago, and try to get through, how many slides do I have here? Oops, I don't know. Oopsie, I'm not doing the right things. I'm going to try to get through this in the next, I got 35 slides. I'm going to try to get through this, in the next day and a half, maybe a little bit next Monday. Okay, so we're going to talk boy crisis. And again, so is there a boy crisis? And my sad boy logo, which I think is actually a band. Okay, so some very brief things. I'm going to be talking a lot about information and arguments from this book. Richard V. Reeves, of Boys and Men. And I think half the time I end up calling him Reeve, so I got to go through and fix that. Because for some reason in my head, his name is Richard Reeve, not Richard Reeves. Okay, I mentioned this book a little bit. It's an increasingly kind of influential book, and Reeve, kind of a social commentator at Brookings Institution in New York City. Pretty, I think, kind of on the middle ground between kind of left and right. And it's a really, really interesting book, mostly dealing with why boys and men are sort of struggling. Okay, so let's talk some basic introductory facts. Historically, men have done better than women, right? Men had significant advantages in academic achievement and degree attainment worldwide. They tended to do better economically over time as well, right? Most women would, until really the 1970s, exited the workforce for significant periods of time when they had children, and the careers they could get into tended to be lower paid. We already talked about this a little bit in education and work, so I don't want to belabor the points, but that has definitely changed. Okay. Today, that is increasingly untrue, right? There are a few bastions where men are doing better than women. For example, in engineering and some math-based STEM disciplines. Virtually everywhere else, women are surpassing their male counterparts educationally. And it's a global phenomenon, right? We're seeing it across every level of education and everywhere in the world, right? In primary, secondary, and post-secondary education. Okay. So, our degree attainment. So we've had big shifts in degree attainment. And again, we talked about this already, so I will try to go through it quickly. From 1972 to 2019, women surpassed men in bachelor's degrees earned, right? So the gap used to be 13% in favor of women, right? Or of men, sorry. Men used to get 13% more degrees than women. Today, it's 15% in favor of women. So the trend has actually swung about 28%, right? So it's a huge swing. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're now past, but the effects kind of linger, caused a big decline in male college enrollment, more so than women, right? More men just didn't go to university, and the trend it exacerbated an already existing trend, and it has yet to recover, right? Now, why is it important? Well, underperforming boys, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, is going to affect them not worldwide, through their whole life course, right? It affects things like their employment and their mobility, socially and physically, basically through the rest of their lives. When we talk about educational inflation, right, and the need for a post-secondary degree, while it's an unfortunate reality that even some jobs that didn't used to require a university degree now do, and I think in a lot of cases, places like Enterprise Rent-A-Car should not force people to have a university degree to work there because why? But it's a reality, right? And so men who are not getting some kind of post-secondary degree are at a severe disadvantage compared to everyone who does have one. And increasingly, that's a lot of women. Okay. Finland. So, an interesting kind of case study here is Finland. So for lots of reasons, Finland is often held up as a sort of model for education systems, right? So when they started doing the PISA, right, the Program of International Student Assessment, this is done by the OECD, and basically every couple of years they do these rankings of countries based on kind of student scores on 3 kinds of tests: reading, math, and science. Finland, for a long time, was very close to the top of the rankings. And the Finns achieved this all while having a relatively relaxed education system, right? Really high standards. Every teacher in Finland needs a master's degree, basically, and they undergo a kind of mentorship. But compared to places like South Korea, where kids study for like 19 hours a day or crazy things like that, or Singapore, in certain cities in China that also have really high scores, the Finns were noted for their like nice work-life balance, right? There's been books written on it. Now, some of this has been kind of rolled back in subsequent years, right? I think a lot of the praise of Finland is like 15 years out of date because the Finnish education system has really sort of lost its relative advantages, and Finland's sort of dropped into the middle ranks of the high ranks of PISA. But it's often held up, as an education model for other countries, right? So Finnish students typically rank pretty high in PISA, and it's been pretty consistent, right? But there's a massive gender gap, right? And this is where it kind of gets interesting. 20% of Finnish girls score at the highest level of reading. It's only 9% of their boys. If you take the average, Finnish and American boys score basically the same on reading. And if you remember from the education unit, Americans don't score particularly well in anything, right? They're in the kind of middle of the pack, like mid to low 20s in terms of the PISA ranking. The US education system is a little bit of a mess. This is mostly true for measures of math and science as well. And if you took the stunning, so if you took the girls' PISA scores out, right? Basically, or the highest performing girls, basically, Finland looks a lot like Alabama, right? Their education system seems nothing special other than they're producing a whole lot of really, really high achieving girls, right? So girls, in general, are about a year ahead of boys in terms of reading ability in all OECD nations. Boys remain just barely ahead in math, right? Okay, now, boys are about twice as likely, 50% as likely to fail all 3 key areas of school compared to girls, right? So to fail math, science, and reading. So boys are much more, there's some really high achieving boys in math, but mostly they're much more likely than girls to be just failing completely. Okay, so girls are 14 percentage points more likely than boys to be school ready at age 5. So there's a really, really strong argument. And one of the things that for a long time people thought made Finland sort of special, and it may be the case still, is that in Finland, girls start school at age 5, boys don't start school until age 7, right? There's actually a 2-year gap in the ages that boys start school. And this is largely down to developmental differences. Okay, there's a 6 percentage point gender gap in reading proficiency in 4th grade, and it widens to 11 point gap by the end of 8th grade, right? So girls are considerably better at reading than boys are consistently, and the gap grows bigger the longer they're in school. In math, boys used to have a 6-point kind of advantage. It shrunk to 1 point, right? So boys are just barely ahead. And the most common high school grade for girls is now an A, and for boys it is now a B in the United States. So this chart is really, really kind of interesting, right? So if we look at, this is a breakdown of, gender composition of high school GPAs in points, right? So if we score GPAs from high to low, low to high, what you see is basically it's sort of the inverse, right? So at the lowest grades, right, 1, 2, 3, and 4, it is dominated by boys, right? Especially the very lowest, right? 64% of those earning the lowest grade are boys. And 36 are girls. And it basically flips at the other end. 66% of those earning the highest grades are girls versus 34% of those earning the highest grades being boys, right? So girls in general are outperforming their male peers significantly, right? And we get into these higher, like past the 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, they're all essentially majority girls getting those grades. But the disparity is the biggest at the top. Okay. You have 7 slides left on yours? Oh, I don't know why. Did I cut some off? I don't know. I need to rebuild the slides that I have on Canvas because I may have taken some out last year. Oh, if they're all about spiritual stuff, I took those out because they didn't work. I didn't like them. I copied height and it was not good. Okay. Yes, we're not going to talk about those. So don't worry. Don't study them. I'll fix the slides next year. I'll rebuild the thing. Why did COVID affect male enrollment more than it affected female enrollment? If you're not here, because you're watching online, you can't see, but I'm making the shrugging emoji. We don't really know, right? And this is actually a pretty consistent finding when it comes to some of the male struggles. We don't really know. We're having a really hard time figuring out what the heck is going on with boys. They're not doing as well. And, I'll get to this when we get to the end of this, because there's been some policy attempts like free college tuition in places like Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is a fun place to say. I've never been there. But saying Kalamazoo is super fun, and I'll kind of spoil it for you. Free college for anyone who did high school in Kalamazoo works really well for girls in terms of increasing their graduation rate. It has no effect on boys. And I have a whole list of initiatives that were tried that have a great effect on women and no effect on men whatsoever. And when you ask why, all of the experts, right, the statisticians and all the people crunching data are like, there's no reason. We can't figure out what it is. And so we're kind of stuck. And the same thing here. We don't know. But for whatever reason, COVID hit and men were like, yeah, I guess I'm not going to college. And they didn't. And we don't know why. Okay. So, graduation. By 2018, 88% of girls graduated from high school on time. So in the US, this means after 4 years, right? It's 82% of boys. So not a huge disparity, right? We're talking 6-point gap, but still a gap. Among the poor students, it's about 80% that complete high school. Okay. So that means 20% are not completing high school, which leaves them at a severe disadvantage. So why? Well, again, we don't know exactly, but what Reeves sort of theorizes is that it has a lot to do with brain development and levels of maturity at different points. Boys' brains develop much more slowly than girls do, right? And this seems to, again, be a sort of evolutionary prerogative. Slightly more boys are born than girls, kind of naturally, right? In a natural population distribution, it's about 51% of babies are boys, about 49% are girls. And girls, there seems to be this biological imperative to get them to reproductive age and get them, again, if you're talking state of nature, get them reproducing quickly so that they can pump out the next generation before disease or childbirth claims their lives. Really, honestly, evolution's a nasty, nasty, nasty critter. But for that reason, it seems evolutionarily, women mature a little bit more quickly than boys. Now, this used to not really matter, right? Because that was just the state that human beings lived in, and whatever, right? But as we've entered kind of post-industrial age, this seems to put boys at a disadvantage because we broadly treat boys and girls the same, right? We expect that a 6-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl are going to have roughly the same abilities. We expect that a 15-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl are going to have roughly the same abilities as well. Okay, parts of the brain that control impulse control, right? It matures 2 years later in boys than girls. And this one, the cerebellum, right, important for reasoning, reaches its full size at age 11 for girls. It doesn't reach its full size until 15 for boys, right? A full 4 years later. What this seems to manifest in is quite a bit of advantage for girls in the school system that we have created, right? And this 2019 report on the importance of the new science of adolescence in the Journal of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine suggests that sex differences in the associations between brain development and puberty are relevant for understanding prominent gender disparities during adolescence, right? But this is new science. We're figuring this out as we get better and better brain scan technology. All right, the gap in the development of skills and traits most needed for school seems to be the biggest in the years where you have to worry about your GPA the most, right? Where things like college admission is on the line. Where a lot of your future is being shaped, specifically around grades 9 to 12, right? So boys are at a sort of cognitive disadvantage. If you've always thought that boys are kind of dumb, right, and teenage boys are especially dumb, it's not just your perception, it's actually like science, right? Hashtag the science. And boys are at a particular disadvantage in those really formative years when academic success is really on the line. It just hit 50. I will stop here at this perfectly ended slide, and I will begin here at this other slide. Huzzah, huzzah. I've already done 10 slides. I can do 25 more next class. I am good and powerful.